Okay, hi, and welcome back to the winter part of this program. Everybody had a great Chag and gained a lot from it. We certainly gained a lot from it, especially in Hoshana Rabbah, Baruch Hashem, miracle, and Nes Gadol, Galui, as my people I've spoken to feel the same way, that no one saw this coming so quickly or at all. People had given up hope, and almost to the day, one day before Shmir Atzeres, all of a sudden this happens. It's not completely over yet, but it's certainly much more advanced than it was before. And the timing, of course, is absolutely significant. I don't know if Trump and Netanyahu and Hamas had worked it out that Hoshana Rabbah was the best thing to do this, but from our perspective, I remember the last time that such a major event happened on Hoshana Rabbah like this type of thing worldwide was back in 2001 after the attack on the Twin Towers, when George Bush had sent American ships in the direction of Afghanistan looking for bin Laden and all those with him, and everyone wondering when the first missile would be fired. And I was actually sitting in my sukkah with relatives of mine at the time, listening, following the news, the good old days when news wasn't as false as to this today, but everyone on pins, so to speak, wondering what's going to happen, where it's going to do, and where it's going to go, what's going to lead to. You have to also go back to that time after the World Trade Centers was attacked. So everyone felt it was very Gog Umagogish, and especially since it was coming after Y2K, right? At that time, there was a shift in the mentality of the world at that time. We got used to it. We get used to almost anything, unfortunately. But at that time, it was very dramatic, and the first cruise missile shot from an American warship was just after the sun had set in Eretz Yisrael on the seventh day of Sukkot, which of course was Hoshana Rabbah. And the reason why that's so significant is because Hoshana Rabbah, of course, is a day of judgment, not just for the Jewish people, but for the entire world. Rosh Hashanah is specifically for Klal Yisrael, and the Chatima, we say, the closing of the judgment is on Hoshana Rabbah, but also for the nations of the world. There's a certain, so it involves the nations of the world. Sukkot itself involves the nations of the world. We don't bring karbanas, sacrifices for the nations in Pesach. We don't do it on Shavuos, even though it's one day, but we do bring karbanas on Shavuos, and we don't do it for the world. Only during Sukkot that we do. We start off with 13 parot, and then we bring 12, and Chazal explained the reason why we start off with the number that we start off with, and then we end off actually with 70 altogether, corresponding to the 70 nations that we're supposedly bringing sacrifices on behalf of. But according to Chazal, the reason we don't add, as opposed, instead we subtract from the numbers, is to represent the fact that at the end of days, the koyach of the nations will dissipate. And this is also one of the reasons why the war of Gog and Magog is associated with Sukkot specifically, as we read the Haftorah on Chol Moed, right? And this is all part of the end of day scenario, which plays into all of this, and we never know what's going to happen next. As my son corrected me, history is not unpredictable, because for the most part, history refers to the past, and that we already know. It may have been unpredictable at the time, but once it's happened, it's happened. But the future certainly is unpredictable, and things change. And I always come back to this one idea, this one pasuk, where it says in the Chumash, "V'yakam el chadash," back in Mitzrayim. This is the paradigm for all exiles and redemptions, going back to the beginning, right? And it mentions that a new king arose, and that changed everything. And what's very fascinating, or put this way, was very educational, insightful, is the fact that there's a machlokus, there's a disagreement amongst the rabbis whether or not this was the same Pharaoh who had a change of heart, or whether this is a new Pharaoh altogether, because the old Pharaoh would not change his heart, because they never really liked Yosef and the Jewish people that much, but Pharaoh somehow had some kind of sense of gratitude towards Yosef, and he tried to, he respected him, at least while, for the period of time. And this continued until Levi, the last of the Shvatim, died. He was the last one to go in 2332 from creation. Forget the actual date in the Western calendar, but at that time, that's when the oppression began, And they came to Pharaoh. They said, "Listen, if you want to stay Pharaoh, you have to start. We don't like these people. These people are numerous, and they might work against us, and we're just jealous of them, basically. But so we want to oppress them. We want to turn them into slaves." And Pharaoh said, "You can't do that because we owe them, Joseph and his descendants, for what he saved us." And they said, well, either you change your mind or you change your position because we're not going to, we want, this is what we're going to do. So apparently, even though Pharaoh's claimed to be godlike and came from God, apparently you could still impeach them, which they had, and he left or he retired, he quit, leave of absence to consider the situation. And some say he never came back and was replaced by one who was not benevolent, right? And others, which is really the prevalent opinion, the more prominent opinion is that it was the same Pharaoh who changed his mind, and that's I can't emphasize the importance of that enough because whether it's talking about a person or talking about a nation or talking about a situation, but it just goes to show you how something can look good years, it could take 15 minutes sometimes, but the whole situation can change. The reason why that over 100,000 Jews who had the opportunity to leave Germany between 1933 and 1939 was like an ideal situation given the circumstances. 60 some odd thousand Jews left and moved to Israel, and their families are still here. And the others who stayed behind a lot, right, did so not because they were suicidal, not because they said, nope, this is a terrible place to be. That's why we're going to stay, right? They're going to kill us, so let's make it easy for them. They won't have to chase after us. They didn't say that. They said that we're just as German as the next German, and as bad as it's getting right now, it won't get that bad, right? We'll be able to somehow recover from the situation. They had no idea how bad it's going to get, right? And because they were comfortable there, they were used to it. It was where they lived their lives for generations. I mean, German Jews go back a long way, and so they had houses, they had heritages, they had all kinds of things built up over a long period of time. Some great rabbis had come from there, right? And so they didn't recognize the place that they were used to and how it could become the most dangerous place in the world to be. And that goes on over thousands of years. I mean, sometimes in the past, for example, in Spain also that happened too. But in many times it wasn't that we were comfortable where we were. It was just that we had no way to get out, no way to travel, nowhere to go. So we just had to like try to bear with the situation and somehow survive it. And often we didn't, and some did. But you know, it's the same thing today. It's a modern world, and so many differences between now and 60, 70, 80, 90, 100, 200 years ago, but man never changes. Anti-Semitism definitely doesn't change. The clothing on it, the way what people think and believe, but a Jew has to know that as good as the situation is today, it can always change. And one of the reasons why that's the case is because history is not controlled, by anything random. There's no aliens out there controlling history. It's not just a natural cause and effect relationship. It is Hashgacha Pratis. It is God Himself. When you say the Shema Yisrael Hashem Elokeinu Hashem Echad, you are basically saying that everything that happens is from God and it happens for a reason. It happens according to a time clock. That's you just have to know how to read the signs and how to respond and how to react and how to read, what it is that you have to do, and always live with this reality that if you're not living in Eretz Israel, you're living in the diaspora, no matter how much money you make and how many houses you own, you have to always live with one foot in, one foot out, because the situation changes very fast. People assume that always be enough time to realize what's going on and deal with the problem. And if you have to, still get out. That's almost never the case. The only time that's the case is people who have seen in advance, who saw it 30 years ago, 40 years ago, 10 years ago, and they were able to make aliyah on their own terms because the world was still safe enough. You could still travel as a Jew. You could still sell your house if you had one in the diaspora for a good price, and you could raise your kids to speak Hebrew, and you could make the necessary preparations. It's much more difficult today, and again, becoming more increasingly more difficult as time goes on. And if it ever gets to a point where Jews have no value to society, as has happened almost every single Tekufa, then it means that you might have to just walk away from your house and your property because it's either stick around and get killed for it or leave it behind and just, get out with your life. That's Jewish history. That's not an opinion. That is simply Jewish history. And when the Torah tells you the Yaakov Melech Hadash, it emphasizes this verse. It's telling you you have to know it's as simple as that. One leader can change his mind, can change his outlook. So whoever it is today, he could be Gog. He can easily be Gog. Today, he could be Gog, and you wouldn't even necessarily know it because the situation, the circumstances, whatever it is. I mean, it's brought down by in the Medrash and from the Nevi'im, and the Lashon speaks about this as well. That it's the appearance of Mashiach, it's nations, and that happens so easily. It's you just have to not cross one T, and somehow that changes everything. And not necessarily because that's who they are, but because that's what Hashem wants. And that's the thing you have to always remember. That's the point you can't ever forget. What does Hashem want? Don't logic. Logic is great. When things are going well, it's quiet, and Hashem gives us that freedom, that liberty to make decisions like that. But there's times in history where you cannot rely upon human logic. You have to rely upon tradition, Masorah, Simanim, things that HaKadosh Baruch Hu gave to us, as it says in Parashat Azinu, right? Which we just finished, right? That it says that Zohar Seimas. You have to remember the days. Don't forget history, because those patterns of history are what you're going to rely upon in the future to try to understand what God wants at that particular time. And always, as a Jew, pays to err on the side of caution. Always. So, coming off of Sukkot, right? This class is called Succah of Peace, and you might be wondering why we're speaking about Sukkot after Sukkot, but it's already over, right? We shut the whole thing down, taking down our Sukkahs. Lulav and Esrog, someplace else, waiting to be burned on Lag BaOmer or Bedikas Chumetz, and we're moving on into the winter, right? Now we're looking forward to Chanukah, this Hashem at this point in time, but not Sukkot is an all year round thing, even though you only go into for 7 days, right? But the message is all year round. To start off with one particular point, right? The gematria of Esav, right? Ayin Samach, Ayin Sin Vav. The gematria of Esav is the same as Shalom. They have the same gematria, the word Shalom. And you'll think to yourself, well, that's very strange, because why would Esav, who seems to be so anti-Shalom, be for Shalom in the end? How could they be the same thing? Well, it's actually very similar to the concept, as the Gra points out, that the gematria of Das is equal to Erev Rav, or the gematria of Erev Rav is equal to Das. Erev Rav, of course, is the mixed multitude, who have the worst Das in the world, and Das usually is a concept, we'll see, it's everything. It's all about Das, going back to the beginning. It was an Eitz Das Tovara. The first test that mankind ever underwent was an Eitz Das Tovara, tree of knowledge of good and evil. If the whole point of the test, which is the way most people look at it and deal with it, is only about loyalty, about how to listen to God when He says do or don't do something, then it didn't have to be a tree of knowledge of good and evil. It could have just been a tree. God could have said that fruit. What kind of fruit? It doesn't matter what fruit it is. I'm just telling you right now, right? Your mother, says to you, "Don't take a cookie before supper." What kind of cookie? It doesn't make a difference. I'm telling you, don't take the cookie. It's not important. I just don't want you to have the cookie. Don't eat the fruit. Doesn't make a difference what the fruit is. Why must we know it's a fruit specifically of Das Tov and Das Ra? Because that's what all of history is going to be about. At the beginning, in the middle, and specifically at the end, in our period of time. Because that's clearly what the world's about right now. It's all about Das. What you know, how you know it, whether you can rely upon it, whether it's truthful or not. This is all this is the whole Nisoyan of this generation, which makes perfect sense. Because as we mentioned before in the past, that the 1,000 years are rooted in the 6 days of creation, And as the Vilna Gaon points out, that whatever happened during the 6 days of creation is going to happen during the 6 millennia in the respective time. So I won't go through the whole calculation right now. I got several books on it. We've talked about it before in the past, right? But as of 1990, that corresponds to an 83.33 year period of time, what we would call the 10th hour of the 6th millennium, because according to the Gemara, that Adam Rishon was commanded the 9th hour. Well, what do I mean by 9th hour? Well, basically, the day itself is starts at sunrise and ends at sundown. That's a Jewish day. And then it comes the night. It starts the night before, actually, right? But the whole day, of course, is 24 hours. But and hours are halachic hours, because in the summertime, no, so in the summertime, you could have an hour, Jewish hour, that's equal to less than 60 minutes. And in the wintertime, you could have a Jewish hour that's equal to more than 60 minutes. So that's called a halachic hour. But altogether, 24 hours, right? And the daytime hours, there's 12 halachic hours from sunrise to sunset. And you divide the day into those 12 hours, depending upon how much sunlight there is, will determine how long the hour is actually going to be, which is why the zmanim, the times for davening, change every day, because the hour itself is changing every day. So according to the Gemara, that Adam Rishon was commanded the 9th daylight hour of day 6 not to eat. And the whole hour passes, right? And the 10th hour, right, that's when he actually makes the mistake of eating the dust of a raw, the catastrophic mistake of all history for for mankind, which we've been fixing up for thousands of years. Even the exiles of the Jewish people and redemptions are all part of that. And the final redemption will be really of all of mankind, and the tikkun for the original chet, which is why it's pointed out that the gematria of Mashiach and Nachash are the same, because the Nachash, the snake, is what began the exile with what we would call Das Ra. Just take a look at this week's Parsha. I mean, I actually spent some more. I mean, I've seen it so many times before, but there's so much going in there. Right? So much has to do with what it's all our history in those few psukim there. You really have to meditate on them, and even there's 3 words. In fact, I was looking for the point of no return, because if you could figure the point of no return, there's no way to. I mean, I don't know of any way to know exactly the timing of it during the day to say it was that time, so you can calculate it within the course of the millennium. But I'm pretty sure at the moment of no return, where it says that she took and she ate and then she gave, right? Taking it was already bad enough, but the actual isser was eating it, or consuming it, whether intellectually, whether physically. But at the moment she ate it, that's the turning point of history. That's now guarantees exile henceforth for thousands of years. And that probably corresponds in our millennium, in our period of time, to when Mashiach is supposed to come, because Mashiach will take us out of exile. He'll be the tikkun for the Nachash by giving us Das Tov. And history is about either Das Tov or Das Ra. And don't think that you automatically have Das Tov because that you live by Torah mitzvahs, because it's very easy to actually get stuck in the realm of Tov, the Ra, evil, good, and evil, especially since Moshe broke the first set of tablets. Because with the first set of tablets he brought down from Mount Sinai, the top of Mount Sinai, there was no evil, there was no bad, there were no mitzvahs saying don't do that. Right? There was no punishment associated with the first set of tablets. That level of Torah is called Torah Tzilus. It's called Torah Mashiach. We lost that. When Moshe broke those tablets, he had to replace them. And they were on a lower level. And as a result of that, we have what's called Torah's Bria, which is the Torah that we learn every single day. And it's very, very different. It's exactly the same Torah. It's just that it's on a whole different level. And if you want to understand the first set of tablets, you have to work through that level to get to the upper level. But it's all about this concept of das. And this comes clear through Sukkah. Sukkah is extremely important in understanding and the arbor meaning and the whole process, right? The whole process, right? So back to the idea. So Esav and Shalom, why is that? because just like, for example, the Erev Rav, yes, they're Das, but they're Das Ra. They represent Esav's point of view. They're the negative, the wrong approach to knowledge that turns mankind away from God and not in the direction of God, which is not a new thing. I mean, this week's part, well, actually next week's parsha, but a start in this week's parsha, that there's going to be a flood. And why is it going to be a flood? Because man didn't learn his lesson, and he followed das ra as opposed to das tov, good knowledge, good das. So God rebooted creation by bringing the flood, and this has gone on all through history. So the idea of shalom, which is very very appropriate now to talk about, because here we have an agreement. We're talking about a new stage of history. You ask anyone living here, do you believe it's going to last? Most people don't really believe it's going to last because of the mentality, because of who we're dealing with. The world doesn't understand the Arabs or the Arab mind or Hamas. They don't understand what they think, you just ask them yourselves. I mean, deep in their heart of hearts, right? Even if they could have had, well, even went to that power for the time being. But the main point is that the word shalom itself, even though it's equal in gematria to Esav, the word itself is written Shin Lamed Vav Mem. And that word, right, has in it, the center of it, Lamed Vav. And for those who recall, Lamed Vav is the number 36, which we'll get to later on at some point, B'ezras Hashem, is the number of the Oregon News, the hidden light of creation, the Das Torah, the ultimate knowledge a person needs to connect to God and to live by truth. So it's telling you that, Wednesday I asked Henry Kissinger about peace in the Middle East. Henry Kissinger was not my favorite person, politician, especially as a Jew, right? But there's one thing I heard in his name that I thought was at the time was quite clever, and remains to be true this very day. When he was talking about world peace in the Middle East, someone asked him if there'll ever be peace in the Middle East, and his answer was that depends how you spell it. Right? The way that we spell it, Jewish people spell it, is P-E-A-C-E, if you spell it in English, right? The way the world spells it is P-I-E-C-E, right? Which means take Israel apart and give it away to everybody else, as they're demanding again, now, all over, all through history. That's the very first Rashi, this week's Parsha, how that's going to happen, right? But the idea is that Lamed Vav refers to the input of HaKadosh Baruch Hu. That if God Himself, and that's what we say Friday night in the Brucha Hashkivenu, that God should spread over us His Sukkah of peace. We say every day, that God should bless His people with peace, telling us that if God's not involved in the peace, there's no shalom. It can't last, which is significant because, personally, after knowing this, it's actually quite amazing this day and age that, of such heresy, excuse me, in this day of age of such heresy, there's very few political leaders that get up and refer to God in their speeches and to say it's a great day for God or to thank God for what's been accomplished. Very few. For someone to get up there and say from the beginning, you could just see the eyes of the leftists rolling. You could just see, for the atheists, it's like heresy. To mention God in today's politics, well, who are you? If you're a rabbi speaking from the pulpit, it's one thing. But if you're somebody just talking in the street, but as a leader of a world power, maybe the world power today, although China probably is that, that today, that doesn't seem to fit in, and yet he does it quite proudly. And when he was almost, killed and he was survived, he made the point of saying that God saved him. So, he's a kind of an anomaly, President Trump. Not passing judgment on him, tell you what I think about him as a president, but I have to say the fact that these are his words, even if he doesn't believe it through and through, to take that risk and to say it, not just for the Jewish people, but for the world to hear that, and for even Netanyahu also as well. I mean, Israeli Prime Minister, other than Menachem Begin, Shalom, they don't. The Constitution doesn't even acknowledge the reality of God. and they barely ever talk about them anywhere except when they're trying to bring down the Haredi to make fun of the religion. But to say it and stand up there in the world, the eyes of the world, and to bring God in the picture, that's important based upon this concept of shalom, right? So basically, it's telling you that if you really want shalom to last, God is the only one who can do it. Because let's face it, there's so many factors that come into play making peace that there's no humans that could arrange it. I mean, for us to have peace with our enemies, our sworn enemies who live to see us wiped off the face of the earth, right? So you can say, well, not today as much as it used to be because they're more concerned with local issues and prosperity, things like that. Yeah, but that's a Kush Baruch Hu. Hashem distracts them with that type of a thing. Whatever it is that's pulling people away from the Jewish people, that's a nace. It's a miracle. It's not just economics. It's not just philosophy. It's God Himself arranging history that should be the case. So we actually find this, in a Gemara talking about the same type of a thing. The Gemara brings down that the word for man is ish, and the word for woman is isha. And the two words have in common aleph shin, which spells aish, fire, right? And the letters they don't have in common, well, the man is a yud, and if the isha has a hey. And these, of course, are the two first letters of God's name. They're a name unto themselves. So the Gemara darshans, the Rabbi Kiva darshans out and says, so in this you see, the couple is blessed to have God in their marriage, in their relationship, then the marriage will last. There'll be shalom bayis. Everyone wants shalom bayis. All the school is for shalom bayis because it is such a miracle. If you're blessed with it, somehow comes easily to you. That is a miracle in itself. Most couples have to build it. Most couples have to work on shalom bayis. There's more therapists today helping couples with shalom bayis than probably ever before. And the reason is because the Gemara is telling you flat out that God has to be involved. You can't have shalom bayis without God. What about the fact there are all these irreligious people who are seemingly peacefully and happily married to one another? Well, first of all, you don't know what level God is in their life. That's number one. Number two is you can ask the same question about how evil people prosper too. We know that. That's not a new thing. That we're not interested in the exceptions to the rule. We're interested in the rule itself. Because there are lots of times that God, as the Gemara says and elsewhere, where God says, I can't get to this person. So you know what? Let me give him good in this world. The lesson brings us down in terms of Rosh Hashanah. Let me give them good in this world, and I'll get to them later on. They'll pay. It's almost like they're running becheshbon in the meantime. So God gives them shalom bayis. God gives them, whatever prosperity they have, and then later on in Gehenna, after the world's over, that's when the reality will settle in. But if someone is open to the idea of change and tshuva and connecting to Hashem, then Hashem will be mitzvah them in this world, as it says that Hashem, chastises those whom He loves, right? To give them das, to open them up. And this is a shir into itself. We can, goes on and on. This idea we actually have one coming up called, about suffering and how that fits into the whole picture, right? But in the meantime, the point is that true shalom bayis requires God. So, because if you take the yud and the hey out of the two names, you're left with aish. So therefore, aish will consume the couple. It doesn't mean that the house is going to burn down, God forbid, with them inside of it. It means that their anger, right, with anger and negativity, these are all associated with the concept of aish and fire. So you already see just in that simple idea of shalom bayis how you can have this concept of God being involved and being porous Succah shlemecha aleinu, right? That He is the one who makes it happen. So Esav equals shalom, but his idea of shalom is Piece. Our idea of shalom is a sukkah. It's a sukkah, right? It's a place of shalom. But how do you get there? You don't just walk into it. It's a process that really begins with Rosh Hashanah and goes through Yom Kippur and actually becomes sukkahs in the end. And even though we shut it down, we leave the sukkah. The reality is the reality of the sukkah itself. One of the reasons we read Koheles on sukkahs, right? Shabbos Chol HaMoed, read Koheles, Ecclesiastes, right? And there it's the whole about how the physical world doesn't really matter unless you're using it for a spiritual purpose. In fact, that's really what Rosh Hashanah is. We go into Rosh Hashanah as physical beings having a spiritual experience, if that, right? Because we get involved in the world of Gashmias. We look in the mirror and we don't see a soul, we see a body. We look at people, we don't see body, souls, we see bodies. We talk to people as bodies, right? Sometimes people with exceptional souls will say, what's nice in Eretz Yisrael, a lot of people refer to people as neshama. They call it neshama, as a way of addressing a person. It kind of reminds you, right, that that's the case. But usually people who exude have chen, which is coming from the Shema, right? So then you're reminded that really first and foremost the soul, and the body is secondary. But for the most part, we deal with the physical world, eating, drinking, dressing. It's pretty much very physical. And then you go through Rosh Hashanah, and you do tshuva. You open your mind to the idea of judgment. The whole point of blowing the shofar is to wake you up to realize that we descend from Yitzchak, who went through the Akedah, right? And that somehow it's supposed to melt us. We do this for 30 days in advance of Rosh Hashanah, 29 days, and the whole concept, as the Rambam points out, is to break us, meaning right, to make us Yiras Shamayim, to make us real with the real goals of life. That's what it's about. That's what it's for. So then you go to Yom Kippur. Of course, Yom Kippur, you become like a malach. You can say Baruch Shem Kavod Machus Med out loud twice, right? Night and morning. It is because we become like angels. Otherwise, the rest of the year, the angels don't like the fact that we're stealing their line, but they don't mind Yom Kippur because we look like angels. So what's being transformed? What's being transformed? The soul? The soul's always like this. The soul's always like an angel. That's what the Gemara says. That's what life says. So, the intuition says. Soul is spiritual. It's like an angel. The body, that's what's got to change, right? It's very physical, very gashmi, very, very, driven by desire. You go to Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur, especially Yom Kippur, and you daven and I mean, look, all the inuim, right? The 5 different things we don't do on Yom Kippur, right? Eating, drinking, wearing shoes, right? Intimacy. What's the 5th one? Not washing, not bathing, right? These are all things to do with the body, right? We're trying to get the body, to elevate the body to a much higher level, to come closer to the soul. That's why immediately after Yom Kippur, you're supposed to start building your sukkah. At a pshat level, the idea is that you're trying to go from one mitzvah to another mitzvah, start the year off on the right foot, literally, right? But the other reason, the main reason, is because whatever it is you gained from Yom Kippur, you're trying to imbue into your sukkah. You're trying to bring your sukkah. In fact, the halacha is that you cannot use something that's makabel tuma for the schach. What does it mean? You can't use any material for the schach that if it becomes wet, it becomes impure. You have to use something that can't happen. So the branches, wood, things like that don't become tummy because of like metal that does become tummy. But the walls you can. The walls you can use metal, things like that for the walls because we don't have the same halacha. So the Rizal explains why. Because the schach belongs to the level of bina, a very high level of light in the spheres. It's in the level of Yom Kippur. And it encompasses us. It protects us. That's why you have to sit in the shade of the schach, not the shade of the walls. Because that level of schach, that level of light that we're taking with us from Yom Kippur into Sukkahs, right, is going to transform us and the world. That's the das. That's what we call das. In fact, the Arizal was very makpid, very stringent about the idea of performing the what we call the nanuim, right? The shaking of the arba meaning, which is the lulav and the hadassim and the aravos and the esrog, right? He would do it before anything else in the sukkah. Now, I don't know if he did this before Amud Shachar, because he got it very early. But regardless, he did it in the sukkah itself. If you say it too early, you can't make the brucha. But Now, certainly you can do it later on also. If you go to, if you don't get a chance to do it in the sukkah, so you come home later on, but to do it in the sukkah. Why the sukkah? Because basically the arba meaning, right, are made up of 7 different things. You'll count and you'll say, no, there's only 6, right? Because what do you have? You have 3 hadassim, which correspond to Avraham, Yitzchak, and Yaakov, or the spheres of Chesed, Gevur, and Tiferes. You have the 2 Aravos, which correspond to the Netzach and the Hod, right? And then you have the Lulav, which corresponds to the sphere of Yesod. So you have Chesed, Gevur, Tiferet, Netzach, Hod, Yesod, and then you have the Esrog. And for the longest time, I thought the Esrog was the sphere of Malchus. And that's the only one that comes after that. Turns out, no. Right? As the Rizal explains, that the Esrog actually corresponds to something called the Teres Yesod. It's actually part of the Yesod, but it's literally the crown of the Yesod because it's the Sphera that has 2 parts to it. Yesod corresponds to our millennium, and the Gra says that the entire time that the Yesod itself controls history, the Jewish people will be in exile. But the moment that the Teres Yesod takes over and becomes the basis of history, then that becomes Gula. And the Arizal explains that it's actually a proportional thing. It's not, I mean, it's Kabbalah, but it's not a mystery, right? It's right there in the Sforim. But it's actually 2/3, 1/3, which is very interesting because what we're saying the Teres Yesod is 1/3 of the Yesod, and that's the Esrog. That's the Esrog. Right now, the Gemara in Baba Kama says the following thing. The Gemara gets into a discussion based upon a drush and a pasuk, and it says that a person to always be mehadir, right, to do a hiddur mitzvah, right, they should always do 1/3 more than what they would normally do. So, pashtus of the Gemara is that if you're going to buy tefillin and you're willing to spend $600 on it, you should. It's a machlokas whether you divide the 600 by 3 or you divide it by 2 and add a third after that. But let's stick with the pashut shot that you take divide it 3 and take a third after that, right? So if you normally spend $600 in tefillin, you're prepared to do that, then you should add another $200 and spend $800. That would be a third more than what you're used to spending. That's called hiddur mitzvah. I've chosen an expensive mitzvah there, but you can choose less expensive mitzvah. You buy candles for Shabbos, it might only cost you $2. It's like that. So you add another, $2.10. So you can add a third onto that, and that's the way it goes. But interestingly enough, Tosfos, when he brings down an example, what the Gemara is talking about, he brings down the esrog. He says an esrog, for example, you find one that's this big, right? But you also have one that's a third bigger. You should buy the one that's a third bigger, which is interesting because, again, we would have thought it's a financial thing, a monetary thing, not a physical thing, because you're not going to buy tefillin that's 1/3 bigger than the ones you normally would buy. You probably can do that, but they'd be awfully big, and people aren't going around doing things like that. But that's what he uses as an example. Why it doesn't say why? Where's the third come from? It doesn't say why either. But since we understand now that the esrog corresponds to the teres yesod, which corresponds to the esrog, so on a Kabbalistic level, it makes perfect sense. That would be the example, and that would be the number because of that. So you divide the 1,000 years by 3, it turns out that 5666 or 1906 would have been the date of the Teres Yesod begins in history. And the Gra says, yes, it begins, but doesn't necessarily mean that you're going to recognize it's happening. So I've talked about this before. I went back, explained what did happen significantly in 1906, but something I failed to realize at the time and only came to think about it now is that that's also when Einstein came up with the theory, or at least the basis for the theory of relativity. Right? And we have a concept in Kabbalah that anything like that requires a certain, he was a genius for sure, right? But anything like that, anything, groundbreaking like that in the world usually is a spiritual energy that was given to the Jewish people for the sake of Geula, and we didn't use it. Instead, it gets taken by the secular world and used instead in the way that it was used. It's dealing with energy and with light, and how within a single, atom, you can have so much power released if you split it. We'll come back to that later on, B'ezras Hashem. Could easily have been in place of that. That could have been what was meant to happen at that time, or what it's going to lead to. There are other things that we spoke about, which I'm not going to go into right now, but that's the way it breaks down. But the main point for today is that when a person shakes the lulav and the esrog, especially the sukkah, so they're drawing down the light that they built up since Rosh Hashanah by their tefillah, by their tshuva, by the slichos. We're going to higher levels. We're rectifying our vessel. You can only put as much divine light into a vessel as the vessel can receive. So all year round, if we're living very mundane existences and we're not really focusing on spiritual development, so we're limited to how much light we can bring down. Tzaddikim are people who are constantly working on their body as if it's Rosh Yom Kippur. So therefore, they can access the light all year round. But we rise to the occasion because of the Elul, and then Rosh Hashanah, and the Seir Tshuva, and then Yom Kippur, and then Sukkot. It's like, it's like sun panels, right? Yeah, sun panels. And then the building across the road from where I live right now, right? They just covered their entire roof with sun panels because either for emergency, but save money, right? But the interesting thing about sun panels is that they don't do much. I mean, not that you can see. It's not like they light up. The sun comes out and they go all bright red or something like that, right? No, it's like they just sit there, metal things with glass faces, and they receive the light, and you don't even see what's going on. You see all the wires and all, but you can't see what's going on. But when the sun comes out, this hugely powerful, ball of light, 93 million miles away, comes out and gives up its energy. It's powerful, burns us. It can cause cancer, God forbid. It can cause a solar flare. Can eat up the entire electromagnetic magnetosphere. What is it called? And cook the earth, God forbid. They worry about things like that. And if the sun panels collect it, turn it into energy, electricity, and then store it in a battery. And the battery, of course, is what supplies electricity to the house or the building, whatever the case may be. That's what the esrog is. You have all the arba, the arba meaning, right? You're shaking them in 6 different directions, actually going around the hakafas, of course, 7 hakafas. That's how Yericho came down. How did Yericho come down? They were told to go once every single day, and the 7th day was a Shabbos, 7 times, and below the shofar and all that with the Arna Kodesh, and the walls came coming down. What did it? It was just that God said, you do that, you take care of your part, I'll take my part. Not that going around does anything other than the fact that you're following instructions. And then I'll just, I could have done it without you going around, right? But this is the way I want to do it. You participate in, but no, it's the actual going around the hakafas of going on Yericho with the Kavanas, the Arna Kodesh, all these things, the 7 times specifically, that drew down the light of Das. That's what kills the enemy, is the Das. Yes, you have to resort to swords and cruise missiles and nuclear bombs, God forbid, when you stop using the Das. When Das is no longer the option, we're forced to fight very physical wars. But the ultimate reality, which is why Gog and Magog is by Sukkot time, is because of the Das. That's what we're bringing down, this high level of light. And when you do the Nanuim, right, and the esrog, of course, is the bottom part, because the last level of spheres is a teres yesod. So the arba minim are pulling down this light, and the esrog is acting like a solar panel. It's translating that energy into something that can be stored in the sukkah, which is like the battery. And even though it's just a dwelling that we happen to go into to remind us of how once upon a time that we also lived in sukkahs, and it's a machlokus, whether or not it's talking actual sukkahs or we're talking about any akava, but either way, because Baruch Hu made a big deal, but because it protected us. In fact, the reason why is actually Maisa Avos Sim Labanim. The idea of sukkah shows up a few times. It shows up, by Yaakov Avinu. After he leaves Esav, where does he go? He goes to a place called Sukkos, right? Why? Well, it's the same reason why we leave Mitzrayim. We go to a place called Sukkos. Because don't forget, Mitzrayim is Meitzur Yam, right? The constriction of the Nun Shari Bina. The whole concept of Egypt in any generation, because Mitzrayim was once Egypt, in the time of Moshe Rabbeinu. But Mitzrayim is any place, and any person for that matter, who constricts das Torah, constricts the light of das. That's what it is. So as a result of that, we don't learn Torah. That's what Paro tried to do. It says that Paro worked so hard we couldn't speak divrei Torah. That's how he was going to destroy the Jewish people. Cut them off from the Torah, and they'll disappear on their own. Allow them to learn, and they'll stay connected. So that's Mitzrayim. Today, American can be Mitzrayim. There's parts of Eretz Israel that could consider being Mitzrayim. And people are Mitzrayim because they're choking off the Nun Shari Bina. It's amazing when I used to travel a lot and go on speaking trips. So I would, I loved it. It was great. I enjoyed the people. I enjoyed the speaking. It was a great opportunity. I learned a lot along the way. But it's not the same thing as sitting in the base medrash and learning Gemara on your level, or having Chavrusa who's learning Torah the same level that you're able to learn as well. Not the same thing. It's wonderful. No complaints, right? But the moment I would finish, right, all of a sudden you had this yearning to go to base medrash. It's like it was a constriction because it was limited. You would have these Shabbatonim where people would sit together and have a Shabbos meal and they're talking. It was, again, wonderfully nice, but it wasn't necessarily wonderfully intellectual because people weren't on the same level. Not all on the same level. They're doing kiruv. Kiruv often means to go down to other people's level to try to bring them up. That's supposed to be the other way around. Right? I got a lador, right? Or a big rabbi. They used to have these lunch and learns. And they bring a big rabbi to speak. Everybody understood that he was on his level. He's not coming down to our level. So they showed them the respect and the covenant and all. And he wasn't there to do kiruv. He might do kiruv, but that's not why he came. He was there to disseminate Torah. He didn't have to really leave his level, although he obviously altered the way he spoke, somewhat to make it more tangible. But the rest of us, right? We have to go down to talk to people where they're holding, so they can understand and hopefully go up. But it leaves you feeling that as if you fell short somewhat for yourself. So you want to run back and learn and go back to that level that you were on before. And that's what Sukkot was. That's the reason why the Jewish people went to Sukkot right after Mitzrayim. After being in a place of intellectual and spiritual constriction, they went immediately to a place where it was open, where it was outside, beyond, right, the reality of Mitzrayim. That was Yaakov Avinu after he left Esav. Because talking to Esav, you had talked to Esav. You couldn't say, hey, Esav, you want to hear Sukkah? You want to Gemara, right? You want to hear the interesting halacha? No, that's not him. So Yaakov had to make small talk. He had to to socialize, so to speak. But that wasn't him. Yaakov didn't waste a single word. So if he spoke, it was necessary, but still it wasn't the level of Torah he was used to. So the first place he goes to be redeemed from that is Sukkot. And likewise from Mitzrayim, Sukkot as well. And likewise us every single year. And that's what the Arba meaning, that's what the Nanuim are all about. But it all comes down to this idea of Das, which we, B'ezras Hashem, will develop further, God willing, next week. Have a good Shabbos and B'ezras Tovas, and I'm happy to be able to say that we don't have to add anymore, that the hostages just have to come home, as we did in the past, because Baruch Hashem, that nace has already taken place, but now we should be able to finish up, get the rest of the bodies that were promised, haven't been given back yet. But everything that's going the way it's going should only go to get better and not worse. But you have to be prepared. Where's coming up this because of course Baruch Hu has expectations. Shabbat shalom.